Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this session in the York Festival of Ideas Online. My name is Jonathan Derbyshire. I'm the Deputy World News Editor at the Financial Times and a regular chair of sessions for several years now in the York Festival of Ideas, normally happening in obviously in a somewhat different format. But although we're gathering virtually today rather than in person, the festival continues to aim to enhance York's reputation as a city of ideas and innovation through offering the highest caliber of public events. And this session on museums and galleries, locked down but not locked out, I'm sure will be no exception to that. The 2020 festival has over 40 online events offering an inspiring program for all ages. I'm sure some of you have already taken part in the events earlier this week. So thank you for joining us today, and we hope you enjoy the adventure we're about to take you on. A few technical notes before we start. If you're watching live, you can ask questions using the Q&A button on your screen, at the bottom of your screen. This is available throughout the talk, so questions can be asked at any time. Should you have technical issues such as a loss of Wi-Fi, you can rejoin the event using the original link. And please also remember that today's event is being recorded, so you will be able to watch again. So as I said, the title of today's event is Museums and Galleries, Locked Down but Not Locked Out. Now, according to the UK government's current roadmap for easing the coronavirus lockdown, museums and galleries are likely to remain closed until at least July, although museums and galleries on continental Europe have begun to reopen this week. So how are cultural and creative sectors meeting the challenge of engaging with existing and new audiences while their doors remain closed? What part can museums and galleries play in building community resilience and recovery? And looking ahead, will a new model of strategic engagement be needed? To debate and explore these questions, we have a very distinguished panel. And our first, I'd like four people on the panel. They'll each speak for 5 minutes at the beginning, and then I will open up for questions. I will kick off the discussion, but we're very keen that you join the discussion using the Q&A format. So our first speaker, and I'm delighted to welcome her, is Frances Morris, who is Director of Tate Modern. Frances, if you'd like to join us.
Great to be here. Thank you so much, Jonathan. I've only got 5 minutes, so I'll keep it brief. Of course, you know, the key thing for a museum is not just to retain its audience, but build its audience. And like most museums, we've done a lot of serious work around who our audience is, why they come, sometimes why they don't come. And we know we need to serve our demographic of London better. We're not representative, and we are a public institution. We need to be. And we need to build long-term relationships that make a difference. And think about our priorities. It's children and families, and especially those who you could say face most barriers to engagement. And that is currently Black and minority ethnic communities. And we see that in the US and in the UK today as I speak, and families from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. So there are priorities. And it just so happens that in Southwark, where Tate Modern finds its home, they are also our local audience. And I'm personally really interested in the dynamic of how a national and some sense an international museum can also be a kind of generous local place, as well as a place for the art world and tourists. And that for me is a real challenge with the absence of our physical presence. But as a sector, the switch to digital has been incredibly imaginative and fulsome, and I found huge inspiration, really a lot of grassroots work. For a big organisation like Tate, I think it's been our modus operandi in that crowded space, and we took an early decision actually not to do too much, but to focus on the things that were really important to us. So we reduced a huge number of digital needs to 3 basically priority themes. One was deal with what you've got. And like crew members jumping off a sinking ship, we grabbed what we could before we went under. And what we could grab were the exhibitions that we were going to close, like our Great Warhol show, but also the wonderful project we were just about to launch with Congolese dancer Faustin Linikuda. And both those projects we were able to resurrect and put online. And they're like ghosts of the living machine. and we've really valued them, and huge audiences have experienced them. But I think as important, what we have done, we've done a long overdue piece of work on representing the collection and collection-related content. We've used the pause moment to really think about how can we put history into the art history that we talk about, particularly the kind of the terms of representation, so that we've surfaced and acknowledged the kind of the colonial, class and gendered context of so much of our British work in particular. And that's the context that is really driving anger and social unrest at the moment across our community. So that's a really important ongoing piece of work which will drive engagement in the future. So making that connection between what we can do now and our future is really important. It's not just about entertaining ourselves during this moratorium. And then new content, and our visitor audience research and everything we know about learning tells us that audiences like to participate, particularly people coming to the museum afresh. That participation, making, engaging is a very, very deep way of connecting with the museum, with its content, but also connects into issues, agendas of well-being, creativity and social cohesion. So 2 great projects, very popular, very accessible, one with Grace and Perry, How to Make a Pot, and a drawing project with Paula Rego, How to Draw, and a really then fantastic piece, a kind of role model of diversity, working with great British artist Chilla Kumari Berman, with a focus for children. It's very difficult to assess how those play out, but it's interesting and we will build on them. And so far, we see that there's a huge desire for that children's content. Of course, educational content, deeply needed at home at the moment as families educate from home. And we know that schools are failing our families and our kids in relation to arts education. Then, of course, as I said, we are a community museum. We exist in Southwark. And although we're a huge museum, because we're only 20 years old, we're very unwittingly, we have a very significant role to play in the economic and cultural welfare of our neighbourhood. And so it's a difficult role to play. We're hugely implicated in the economic recovery of the neighbourhood alongside the council, with Better Bankside, with the Borough Market and the Globe. So we're really working on coordinating everything we do, not just with the national museums, but with local stakeholders. On a more personal level, and digital has been amazing for this, I zoom into the homes of our neighbours group, many of whom are activists. They call themselves our critical friends. And I'm learning a lot from them, including very difficult truths, which the intimate space of Zoom affords. And they're really pushing us at Tate Modern to envisage a kind of bigger civic role for the Tate. And I think that is a key element of our, the future of engagement in our buildings. Then again, focusing on those audience priorities, we've had a break, a blissful break, dare I say, from the thousands of school kids who descend every day from all parts of the UK on our buildings. And that's given us a space to really think about the kind of hyper-local. And we're working very closely with Southwark Inclusive Learning and an organisation called Heart and Soul. And of course, Southwark is a borough of extremes, a rich and poor, pockets of great educational provision, and the absolute opposite. So we're working weirdly as a national museum in a very grassroots way, not aiming for big gestures, but thinking in a much more organic way, trying to kind of build resilience into the ecology. And that resilience, of course, is built on relationships and give and take. So looking ahead, the pandemic for me is fast tracking a much deeper engagement with the bigger crisis that COVID-19 is arguably part of, and of course that is climate and ecological emergency. And I'm pretty sure that we are really talking now about serious systemic change, not just changing content, not just change in messaging, but we do need to become different organisations. We are failing just as wider society is failing. Museums are meant to be thought leaders, and so me and my colleagues at Tate but across the sector are clearing time, and perhaps I should say our diminished budgets are helping clearing time for us, and we will be going back to the drawing board. So listening and reach out, particularly in our local communities and via the virtual, are going to be key components of our future. So that's all for now.
Thank you so much, Frances, for that rousing call to arms, I think, and a plea for institutions to listen better. I mean, I think it's interesting in what you say that there is a sense in which the coronavirus pandemic has merely made more acute questions that institutions were already having to confront, and maybe that's something we can come back to in in the discussion. Perhaps we should move to our next speaker, Michael White, who's head of the Department of the History of Art at the University of York. Michael, would you mind stepping into the breach while Reyhan sorts out her technical issues?
Oh, that's absolutely fine. I'm very, very happy to do that. So to just give you something to look at while I talk. So the question is, what have I been up to over these last weeks? I'm actually, can't speak about working in a museum, because I don't work at the university, but I have a very close interest in museums as an art historian. And one thing that I noticed early on was the Tussenkunst Quarantäne hashtag that was becoming very popular, which is about reconstructing, recreating works of art at home. And I had a go at one of them at the end of March for the first time. Part of my motivation was just to cheer everyone up, to put something actually on our departmental social media to encourage our community of students and get some engagement just as we were being dispersed to our homes. And the interesting experience was that actually lots of people enjoyed these very much, and I carried on doing them. But it made me think about some other issues relevant to what we're discussing today. It made me think actually about art beyond the museum in a more kind of dispersed way, actually in the home, and the way that actually museums have always existed actually beyond their doors. We should think about them actually as having everything just behind closed doors. They've been very dispersed in all kinds of ways for a great many years, through postcards, catalogues, posters, souvenirs, all kinds of things. And we shouldn't necessarily think about the virtual space now as a completely sort of new thing. Another was that it just reminded me just how much of my experience, enjoyment of looking at art and going to museums and galleries is actually a thoroughly social experience. I enjoy visiting when I can share that experience, when I can discuss what I'm seeing. It's actually all about people, really. Also, it struck me as I was looking at other people's attempts in this particular field of reconstructing works of art using what you've got lying around at home, was just how amazing everybody's visual literacy was. Actually, there's extraordinary things going on that I could see, an enormous amount of creativity, people's response to art, and also a desire, it seemed to me, actually for the opposite of what we think most people want at the moment, actually for some quite slow looking and quite kind of close attention to the visual, which was really encouraging for me as an art historian. So everything that's kind of happening at the moment was a good reminder that the idea of going to art galleries is not really about a kind of solitary, private experience in a sterile space. In fact, quite the opposite. So I think there are some great opportunities kind of coming out of this current situation. One is to extend that idea of the sort of the museum at large into communities, as Frances Wood is describing. Another is actually about the way that it brings people together. The other actually is encouraging this sense of ownership of culture generally, that people actually can sense that it is part of their lives. But I think there are also some risks that we're also seeing at the same time. I think there are kind of dangers that the sort of the virtual museum, or the idea of the kind of digital, can be actually as inaccessible as any kind of physical space, and that some websites actually can be very difficult to enter, not just if you don't know the technology, but actually conceptually as well. There can be a danger also that the authoritative voice of the museum actually gets amplified through them. We have lots of kind of curators talks, but no ways many really to talk back. And also, I think there is a risk that I've been using social media here actually as a way of engaging the community, but we actually kind of sell ourselves out very kind of cheaply to certain social media platforms. But generally, I think there are actually some magnificent opportunities and demonstrations actually of the power of our museums and culture generally in a situation like this. So that's just where I'm going to stop for the moment. And
Thank you very much, Michael, for that. I think you raised some really interesting questions about ownership and engagement, which we can come back to in the discussion. Now, I think Reyhan has at least partially solved some of her technical problems and is going to join us by audio, if not by video. Reyhan, are you there? Welcome back.
Hi, yes, I am here, and I was able to hear and actually see Michael's presentation, which was great. So the coronavirus lockdown has faced museums with a really unprecedented set of challenges. And being honest, for York Museums Trust as a charity, we generate most of our income, 70% of our income, from visitors paying to come to our museums. So the financial challenge has been the biggest one and the most immediate and profound. But alongside that, we were determined to continue sharing our wonderful collections and inspiring people. And we also had to ask ourselves the question, what can an organisation like ours do in times like these? So in completely new circumstances, the challenges and opportunities presented to us required new answers. And sometimes they were answers that are not the kind of answers that museums normally reach, like giving over all of our handling materials for our collections, our gloves, as PPE for the public health team. We had to think about what was going on around us as much as our own core vision. And I think what the crisis has shown is how linked everything is, how culture and creativity actually become important, even more important to people's well-being in times of difficulty. The York Museums Trust is essentially offering two types of engagement during lockdown. One you might call broadcast, in which we share our digital content as widely as possible, joining in with partners like BBC Culture in Quarantine. And we focus there on formats that work well digitally. We don't think it's worth trying to just take a physical thing like an exhibition and put pictures and text up onto a website. So we focused on things like films and social media. Those formats work much better, and I think we really relate as well to what Francis was saying about Ghost in the Machine. So they're really good to have a different way of communicating with people, but it still feels a bit ghostly. So our Harlan Miller film is wonderful and it's available, but it's a ghost compared to the actual exhibition. Our weekly curator battles on Twitter have engaged new audiences all over the world. And every Thursday, we challenge museums to upload objects on a particular theme. By the third week, our creepiest object tweet had engaged audiences all over and had reached 1.5 million people who had engaged with it actively. And it began as a Yorkshire thing, but now museums from all over the world, including America, the Hermitage Museum in Russia, engage with us. And what it's effectively created is a huge worldwide online exhibition on a theme, co-curated by the museums themselves, live, bringing together really fantastic objects that we just wouldn't have been able to bring together in a physical realm. The other type of engagement that York Museums Trust is doing won't reach as many people, but it's intended to be more deeply participatory. One of these is our time capsule project. We're inviting people to contribute by documenting their own experience of this time in COVID-19. We're encouraging them to think about objects that might be a sort of potential museum object and to reflect and photograph that object and share them with us. But we're also encouraging people's creativity, inviting them to draw, to write poetry, or just to snap something with their camera on their phone and share that with us. And I think that by encouraging creativity and also encouraging activities that promote reflection, we are giving people an opportunity to process this experience that we're all living through. Our charity also runs a wonderful civic amenity, York Museum Gardens, and we're really looking forward to reopening them. And as part of celebrating that re-emergence from isolation, celebrating our community coming out again, we'll be including a temporary homegrown display by local people. And both of the projects that I'm talking about support community well-being and recovery. And we're aware too that digital doesn't reach everybody. There is a digital divide. So these projects are also available in physical form through our community hubs and through food banks. And we're really grateful to York City Council for enabling that. Having a strong organisational vision gave us a really strong steer to figure out which activities best deliver our mission at a time when most of our staff are on furlough. We've learnt a lot and we've made new connections. But the emphasis on local is something that's really come home to us in these times. And that's already been talked about in this Festival of Ideas. And I think that is really important for the future of our cultural organisations. We need to be as loved by our residents as by our visitors. And I think this will be critical, not just for museums, but for the wider well-being of our city.
Thank you so much for battling with the technological demons there, Reyhan. I think you raise a very important question, which again we should return to in the discussion about the crucial role that culture plays in times of crisis. I'd like to turn now to our final speaker, Brendan Cormier, who's Senior Design Curator at the V&A. Brendan, how are your technological connections standing up?
Well, let's hope it goes a little bit better. It's always so frustrating when these things happen. So I'll speak really about a specific project rather than about the museum as a whole. I'm a senior design curator in our design, architecture, and digital department, which is primarily interested in contemporary product design, architecture, and digital, as the title suggests, but very much rooted in the here and now. And I want to tell you really quickly about a blog project that we're working on, and also the challenges of collecting at the moment. So an important piece of context is that our department 7 years ago instituted a relatively new and radical for the V&A policy called rapid response collecting, in which we decided, as a provocation in part, that what the efforts of the museum should be focused on in terms of collecting is collecting in the here and now. So collecting really objects that are emerging in the news cycle, and then being able to put them on display and talk about them as they are still newsworthy. And so that's led to a really rich kind of body of collecting, including the first ever 3D printed gun, which is not to say that we're collecting it for its value as a gun, but we're collecting for the kind of design story it tells. So when the pandemic first started to emerge, as a department, we intuitively knew that a certain part of our rapid response collecting should be focused on telling the design stories behind the pandemic as it unfolds. Now, there are a lot of things also that challenged that almost right away. Working from home made it very difficult to be able to go out and contact people. But the other thing that occurred with this crisis is simply the immensity of it. And along with that immensity was an immense amount of projects, an overwhelming amount of kind of possibilities for what might be collected. And on top of that, severe capacity issues. Adding to that, ethical issues. We can't run out and rapidly collect things that are urgently needed. It would be pretty insensitive to go knocking on the doors of a hospital and ask for their PPE just because we think it's an interesting design story. And so those challenges led to an interesting moment where we decided that actually what rapid response
collecting needed to do at the moment was pause. And so that led to the question, well, what do we do instead? And so we turned to a very simple format. And I think a story about a lot of museums is turning to formats that they can, that they already have at hand. We don't have the luxury of inventing fancy new websites. So we turned to a blog. And we started a blog called Pandemic Objects. And the idea of the blog was to look at the pandemic through the lens of objects and to look at the many different ways in which objects were taking on new meaning and you know, relatively heavy senses of new meaning, you know, matters of life and death, and trying to contextualize that, use our art historical capacities to dig back into the collection and make comparisons, but also to kind of reemphasize the core mission of the V&A, which is to talk about, you know, the immense importance and role that objects play in mediating our everyday life. And in a way, what the pandemic has done, it has made that role incredibly clear. So just to give you a few examples, these are objects that, you know, might not be the fanciest things you would see in a museum. They're incredibly plain, but something like a sewing machine, a 150-year-old invention, all of a sudden is being charged with new meaning because people have it in their homes, and there are communities rallying behind the kind of immense pressure to make surgical scrubs. The other thing that really influenced me early on in the lockdown was the emergence of handwritten signs. So again, another incredibly lo-fi technology, but people needed to communicate in new ways. And so they started to simply draw signs, whether that be shop owners or children posting signs in windows. And so the blog itself has been sourcing contributions from curators across the museum, which is relatively new for us. As you know, like most museums, the departments can become quite tribal, but here is a kind of collective conversation across the museum. And it's also a form of kind of publicly engaging with an audience about research that's very much still in the process of taking place. And that's been doubly kind of useful for us because it also is reaching out to people who are sending in emails, suggesting different things that we might consider for collecting. And finally, just to wrap that up, this kind of slow form of blog writing and contributions that consider the role of objects in pandemic is leading eventually to acquisition campaigns and projects. So one of the first kind of campaigns we put out, and another form of public engagement, is a call for what I was mentioning earlier, which is handwritten signs. So examples from all across the country, different kinds of messages, whether that be messages of support, critique, shop owners signs, you know, children's rainbows. And we're trying to create a broad kind of sweep of what the pandemic looked like during lockdown. And this is in itself an incredible challenge that I don't want to eat up any more time. We might be able to talk about later.
Thank you very much, Brendan. I should say that I was looking at pandemic objects before this session started, and it's a really fascinating project which I would recommend to the audience, because one of the things it does is make the familiar strange. And of course, that's what a lot of great art does. And come to think of it, it's what the pandemic has done to our everyday lives, rendered them strange and unfamiliar. Could I ask the panel to unmute and reveal themselves for the discussion? Welcome back. I can see lots of very interesting questions appearing in the Q&A box, but let me kick off with a question of my own for all the panelists. What it seems to me, there was a famous phrase used by Barack Obama's chief of staff, Rahm Emanuel, during the financial crisis, which was never let a crisis go to waste. And it seems to me that's a recurrent theme through each of your presentations, that as well as offering profound challenges, as Reyhan said, I mean, these are financial for one. This crisis and this pandemic has also offered great opportunities. Would that be fair? Do you agree with that? Who wants? Do
you want me to start?
Yes. Yeah, that would be great.
I think from my point of view, and at Tate, it's created the space for a very important conversation. which does relate to our future and the context of climate and ecological emergency. And what we will be doing in that respect is definitely not rebuilding the institution as we were. And so the devastation of our programs and our buildings does create a unique opportunity. And that means that we won't be having a complete blank piece of paper, but I can build in the possibility, the opportunity for making some really fundamental changes. And I find that incredibly exciting and very timely.
Thank you. Anyone would like to come in on that?
I can do
Brendan.
that. Yeah, I mean, I think for me, that sentence sounds almost too calculated, but I do think, accidentally there are kind of discoveries being made which can be applied into the future. And one of the ones that I've found the most inspiring is kind of getting away from this kind of institutional tendency to have to put out the most polished, perfect kind of products, and opening up a space out of need for more experimentation. And so putting out scrappier ideas, there might be some typos in the blog, but it's really kind of the idea of more immediacy in the reaction to events that I'd like to see museums take forward in the future.
And Michael, you seem to be suggesting that this crisis has given institutions a chance to think about ownership and engagement in really radical ways.
Absolutely, we'll wait and see exactly what kind of models do emerge, but I'm absolutely sure that they're going to involve enormous amounts of collaboration and sense of collectivity that actually we need to kind of think about we have a group of museums that we call national museums, but I think we can have to think about all of our museums as sort of national museums, as national assets, really, and share across the sector and include universities here. Universities are very intimately connected to the museum sector, and that we all work as one great big team. And when we do, it's an enormously powerful force that we're a bit kind of atomized at the moment. This can really kind of bring everyone together.
Can I give an example of that, just as something that's really interesting? I was in a conversation with Sally Tallant, who's the director of the Queen's Museum in New York. And of course, Queen's is at the epicenter. It's one of the worst affected boroughs. And I said, so what are you doing digitally? She said, we're using your programs. We're telling everybody to access Tate Kids. And it's fantastic. And I suddenly thought, this is a breakthrough. Content is out there. We don't need to compete. We can share. We can all be, we can all occupy a niche that then we share with other people. There's huge potential there.
Okay, let's move to the audience questions, of which there are many. Let's try and get through as many. Francis, in your presentation, you talked about the challenge for an international institution like Tate Modern to also engage with its local community. And in the case of Southwark, and I'm actually a Southwark resident myself, it's a particularly large Black and ethnic minority community. So we have a question here from anonymous attendee who asks, and this is a question for all of you, what are you doing as organisations to stand with Black Lives Matter at this important cultural moment? I mean, because that's a way of dramatising some of the issues you were talking about, Francis.
Yeah, well, okay, so it's an incredibly serious moment, and we need to do much more than just post on Instagram declarations of solidarity. Today, I've reached out to 3 major BAME artists, offering them our platforms so we can host their material. But actually, what we really need to do is something very quick, but it is longer term. And we do need to make a commitment that in our staff, that we diversify our staff, that we create opportunities, that we break through that BME, AME profile of the museum before 10 o'clock in the morning and the white profile of the staff after 10 o'clock in the morning. So there's a hugely important piece of work to do in a very, very short time frame to begin to turn that around. In relation to the programme, we have over the last 5 years done a huge piece of work to diversify the programme. So it's a much more genuine reflection of the demographic that we serve in terms of the exhibitions and the collection content, but actually changing who we are is the most important thing.
Michael, you talked about in your remarks gallery going as a social activity rather than a solitary pursuit, which I think speaks to this question.
Yeah, but that's so that as someone who's been perusing lots of museum websites, the thing that I found most dispiriting is when you're sort of in a virtual room, sort of traversing it as a disembodied sort of presence, and it's sort of eerily, you know, that's actually proved to be the worst kind of experience possible. And actually, any platform that allows for discussion and debate and interactivity is really what seems to be kind of working. And that's why I hope that everyone can reflect on at this moment. Actually, we have a kind of fantasy about what looking at art is, that is about sort of just one person and an object. And I don't think that's true at all. And that's what's being kind of borne out in actually the things that are proving to be extremely successful, which are all about engagement, all about interaction.
Mm. Reyhan, you're back. Can you hear us?
I can. Can you hear me?
Yes. So I don't know if you heard the question about the extent to which institutions ought to be responding to the Black Lives Matter moment. Now, I know we were talking beforehand about this issue. I know it's something that's particularly important to you.
It is something that's been important to me and has been important to me for a very, very long time. And I think the anger that people feel is that we have had moments before like this, and we've had not, I mean, what is heartening about this is the scale and the global reach now of Black Lives Matter. But I did an exhibition in 1997 at the National Portrait Gallery that described the life of a Black 18th century person, Ignatius Sancho, and yet we are still having arguments with people about whether Windrush was the first Black president in the UK. So I really understand why people are really tired. And I think the other really important thing about Black Lives Matter is the call to allies, the call to allies to do more than feeling like you're allies, but actually acting as an ally. And I think, you know, that is really sensitive, and I'm really heartened by that. And in York Museums Trust, you know, Francis is absolutely right. It's about more than putting up a message or a statement. So we have been using the last couple of days to talk. And, you know, I've got staff who are engaging with these issues, and we're having conversations that perhaps we haven't had, and some of those conversations have been difficult. And we've been on a journey over the last few years, moving our program. So we've had worked with organisations like New Art Exchange to show Sounds Like Her, curated by Christina Ini. And these have been quite important things to do to move the dial for our staff. And I'm really proud of how York Museums Trust staff have responded. And in that sense, you know, museum collections and the way that we have historically collected knowledge around our collections, we do have to acknowledge that the way we've done that was formed by an imperial mindset. And when we recognise this, we need to rethink the collections. And that's about actually telling history correctly. And then I think the fun thing I want to say about museums in particular is that, you know, museums, most of us have got missions that talk about fair workplaces and reaching a wide diversity of people, but we need to do more by working, as I said, to improve knowledge about how racism works. And I have to admit that museums are behind the curve in terms of the diversity of our workforces. So we've got a lot of internal work to do to make ourselves more relevant, more accessible to the BAME employees, as well as recognising that we have had BAME employees in museums for quite a long time, and some have left, and we haven't done what we've needed to do to ensure progression. So, you know, yes, I think there's still more to do, but I think it's a good moment for us to launch that platform further.
Let's take a, thank you, Reyhan. Let's take another question from Jenny. What do you plan to continue with after the pandemic? Brendan, maybe you can take this one. You were talking about the Pandemic Objects Project, which, as I was saying, I think is really, really interesting undertaking. does that simply go dormant once the museum reopens?
Yeah, it's always funny with these projects is once you begin them, and especially projects that are kind of list-based, you don't really know when the proper time to end them is. And with something that's so big, it could seemingly go on forever. There is a plan to, well, keep on posting as long as we find relative and relevant information and objects to talk about. And also, I think, there's a sense of kind of, I think, already settling in of fatigue about the topic itself. But that is to say that, in 6 months, a year's time, there will be a moment to kind of look back on what we've been through, maybe with a more critical edge. And so we're looking at spaces to do an exhibition and a publication in a way to kind of properly record the time and record what happened through the lens of objects.
Yes, I'd quite like to come in, if I may.
Yes,
John.
please.
So I think Brendan's right. There is a kind of tiredness, but I also think that museums can play a role in helping people to process what's happening right now. And before I had all my technical challenges earlier, I was about to talk about our time capsule, where we're inviting people to document their experiences, partly by thinking about objects that might go into a museum, but more than that, by doing activities where inspiring them to create, to draw, to write, to snap something on their phone and submit those, and potentially there may be an exhibition. But the real important thing right now, I think, is by encouraging creativity and reflection, we're giving people an opportunity to process their experience.
Maybe I'll just add
Yes.
something that speaks in a way to both of those answers. This year was Tate Modern's 20th anniversary, which we did not celebrate. We will have a 21st birthday instead. But as part of working up towards the anniversary, we initiated, or our community head of community relations, Donald Hislop, initiated an oral history project to capture the memories, comments, thoughts, engagements of particularly local people in and around Bankside. And that has continued through the pandemic. And of course, it is no longer really a history project because today is so pervasive and the experience is so overwhelming. So it's rather beautifully becoming an oral, a contemporary a history of our times as they unfold. And I think that I would like to take that into the future. So in a way, it's a kind of rapid response, could become a kind of rapid response to our times.
There are various versions of this question. I'll take this version from an anonymous attendee. It's about digital access and engagement. Do you think there is a way of reaching out to an engaging non-tech savvy group, such as older communities at this difficult time, which seems to rely so much on technology for engagement? And there's also a socio-economic dimension to that, because there are many households which don't have access to broadband or to tablets or laptops. Michael, you were talking quite persuasively and eloquently about engagement earlier. Maybe you want to come in here.
Yes, well, I have to preface this by saying that not in the museum, so not thinking quite in that way, but also I have to think about this from the perspective of the university as well. What have I been doing for the last couple of months is thinking about online teaching. We're having exactly the same a question and an issue. And my view of this is that actually some of the most effective things are not necessarily the most complex technical ones. Something I've been doing just recently is just recording little sound podcasts of guided reading. That's just a very, very simple file that you can just listen to. Okay, you might actually need something to listen to it on, but it doesn't need a lot of complex graphics or anything like that. I think there are multiple kind of existing technologies that can be used. I think television has been neglected quite a lot. We've been watching lots of television through things like that, but how do museums go back to kind of engage with audience through that medium? We've gone very fast into online. There are loads of things. Radio's had an amazing resurgence, hasn't it, through the last couple of months? You might think, well, that's not really kind of a thing to do. We don't think about art through, but it can be very, very effective. So I think we can use everything. And this has revealed actually how some of the really simple things are still really, going back to Brendan's point about handwritten science. It doesn't have to be very high tech, it doesn't have to be very expensive.
Brendan or Francis, did you want to come
No,
in?
maybe I just add to that. I heard about a beautiful project today, again coming out of Queen's Museum, where they are sending members of their audience who are obviously who they connect to, but who are seniors and therefore are all self-isolating at home. Many of them don't have access to digital technologies or aren't able to use phones, and they're very simply sending them postcards of works of art, you know, with a little bit of text, and then following those up with a phone conversation.
Okay, let's take another question. This one from Mary Howarth, which I think resonates with some of the things both Francis and Michael were saying about what lies out beyond the museum or gallery door. Do the panel think that our museums and galleries have a role to play in how we rebuild and rethink our high streets and city centres, which could allow access into more diverse audiences? Who would like to pick this one up for us?
Well, I could probably say something on the topic of the way, and this is again, you know, slightly touched upon by Francis and Southwick, about the turning of the focus back to the local. And so for a museum like the V&A, very much like many of the national museums, we strive for international collections, and we strive to have shows that tour all around the world. And even though our mission is really to understand manufacturing and commerce in general, the tendency has been to a certain degree to turn our back on you know, what is being made and how we're making things and industry in our own backyard. And so one of the opportunities I find with thinking, at least in the next few years, is how to again reshift our focus towards local industries, the challenges of retail. So I mean, basically reaffirming what the question just said, which is that is going to be a new priority to look at once again.
Here's a question which I think might be aimed or at Francis from another anonymous attendee. What will museums implement after the pandemic regarding big exhibitions on very famous artists or currents, for instance, Impressionists, Frida Kahlo, etc.? Because this kind of exhibition is usually visited by a huge amount of people, and the risk is to have rooms overcrowded by tourists. Therefore, the social distance will not be fully respected. So you were talking about operating, I think, Francis, at 30% capacity once you reopen. So does that change the economics of big exhibitions?
Yes, of course it does, hugely. And there's so much, we're entering unknown territory. I mean, we're modelling 30%, but in the longer term, who knows whether international travel will return to what it was. And our audience comprises 50% of international visitors. So we're highly reliant on the income. If social distancing remains in place, the kind of the way we install and the way people visit major exhibitions, or that they've become accustomed to over the last 10, 20 years, will not be possible. So there's one thing which is just, you know, we probably can't go on behaving in the way we have behaved. But I think there's also the question is, do we want to anyway? Because I think there is a sense across the sector that we've become so reliant on income generation through big exhibitions for everything that we do, that they've almost begun to crowd out those other things.
Yeah.
And we all need to have a little bit of a rebalancing, because all of us, the V&A, Tate, the British Museum, York Museums, we have extraordinary permanent collections. They're real assets that we don't use. So I think it's a really interesting conversation to be had, is how far are we reliant, truly reliant on those blockbusters, or how far are they kind of a creation of a kind of internal growth economy?
We've got another 8 or 9 minutes left. I'd like to take a question which I think is related to that one from Louise M. And I'd like each of you to have a go at answering this. What do you think the biggest long-lasting change will be after lockdown? That's a good question, I think. Who would like to take that first?
Well, I'll have a go. Jonathan?
Yes, please, Ram.
So I don't know if this will happen, but what I would like to happen is a bit of a rebalancing, as Francis says, but more of a bigger picture rebalancing around the value of our public collections. We shouldn't have to rely on blockbusters, or in our case, ticket entry, for the public to feel that they're blocked from those big exhibitions. What I think I would like to see happen is a sense of the importance to society of a wide range of public assets, whether that's the NHS or art collections and collections of heritage. And I recognise in these economic days this is a real challenge, but I think it is about a question of value and what do people value. And there's so much that we can offer for quality of life that I think it's really important to consider the cultural, alongside things like high streets. These are all different things that contribute to our society.
Michael, what do you think the lasting changes from this pandemic will be for museums and other institutions?
I think I'd follow directly on from that. It will be the whole kind of way that they're financed, because the model before was not working. There's again, I can speak from kind of parallel from the university sector, exactly that there'd been a sort of tacit, covert form of privatization taking place over a long period of time, and that is now kind of unsustainable. And if we value these things, then we've got to find a different way of supporting them financially.
Right, can I add to that? Because I agree with it wholeheartedly, but I don't think that we're going to be in a position to move from a financial model based on self-generation simply to a subsidized model without fundamental systemic change. And I think what the crisis is revealing is that, of course, we institutions, public institutions, are as vulnerable to the pandemic as society and politics and the general economy is vulnerable. And those elements are going to have to change. Society will change, politics will change, our economy will change. And within the change that we face, we have some responsibility for shaping that change. It won't just be about finding another means of continuing to operate in the way we do. And in that lies tremendous opportunity.
Brandon.
Well, I think it was what I was mentioning before. So a shifting of focus, not towards kind of globalized collections. We've gotten to this point now where you can go from Boston to New York to Hong Kong to Sydney, and you visit an art museum and you see essentially the same artists all over and over again. So that shift towards a reconcerted effort to really look. And not in a provincial way, but to really look deeply in what's in our own backyard and come up with new creative means of exploring and researching and documenting that. I think that's a fabulous opportunity.
We probably have time for one quick final question. And there's one here, Francis, directed to you from Ian. Francis made a statement about, quote, a bigger civic role for the Tate. What does this mean?
Well, I think it points to the question that you referred to earlier about the purpose of art, in our times. And I think, art, culture occupies a crucial space between, if you like, politics and the individual. And we live in complicated times, and there are very few spaces where you can negotiate that space. And I think the museum is in a world of diminishing private space and diminishing time, has a hugely important role to play in facilitating people making the translation or the journey between the two. And we live complicated lives, incredibly complicated times. Uncertainty is here to stay, and we need to build resilience. And that resilience we will find in negotiating that territory through art, and through conversations around art, and through making art.
I think you've succeeded admirably in finding grounds for optimism amid radical uncertainty, Francis. I wonder whether the other panelists share Francis's qualified optimism about how we reimagine the future.
I think I do. This is Reyhan, and I think, you know, one of the things that we currently are trying to do online, but which we can do so much better in the real world when we're able to get back into the physical spaces, is we can create space for people to have those important discussions and to debate the issues that face us. And we can do that through our displays, but equally we can do it through the ways we engage our audiences in the conversations. And I think it's working together with communities and audiences that will help us make that a better future.
Michael, do you share that outlook?
I think I do deep down, absolutely, because you know, as you pointed out at the beginning, and has been, you know, repeatedly mentioned, so many things were already happening that actually will continue in some form, will actually become the future. They were all. It's not like actually we've stopped completely doing something. They're going to start doing something completely new. They were already in train, and this actually gives us the chance to realise.
Brendan, I'm going to give you the last word.
Gosh, that's an awful thing to give me, because I was going to end with a bit of pessimism and just a reminder of the kind of incredible slow-moving ships that institutions are, and a lot of the questions and challenges that Francis raised will require a lot of heroic and difficult decisions being made within the inner workings of a museum, and that will probably never get talked about in a public discussion like this, but there's a lot of work to be done.
Well, that's a very useful corrective. As a great sage once said, the appropriate stance in a crisis is pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will, which I think is probably a good place to stop. Thank you so much to our four speakers, particularly to Reyhan for battling with technology to take part this evening. Just a couple of notes before we end. The recording of this event will be available on the festival YouTube channel, which can be accessed from the Watch Again section of the festival website, but please allow a couple of days for it to appear. And we hope that you'll continue to be engaged with York Festival of Ideas. Check out the website, yorkfestivalofideas.com, for full details of all the events in the festival programme, and we'd love to hear your thoughts on these events and continue the conversation using the hashtag York Ideas. So were we in a physical hall, I'd ask you to join me in applauding our four speakers, but we'll have to do that virtually. Thank you all for participating. Thank you for your questions. There were many more questions than that we were able to answer, but I hope you found this an illuminating and inspiring discussion. Thank you all very much, and see you again soon.